Let's just pretend that that's what I look like right now, and we'll ignore the fact that I don't have video on today. So what I like to do actually when I am presenting remotely, because you guys don't actually get to see and talk with me afterwards, I just kind of like to talk a little bit more about myself, just to hope you don't mind. I'm kind of narcissistic that way. And I live, like I said before, in a little city in Canada called Regina. Just a little picture. We're not too big. Our big claim to fame is that if you've seen the movie Deadpool, you've probably heard of us. And then another thing too is that I'm not always in front of the computer. I'm not like every other. A lot of geeks. We're not always in front of the computer. This is something I do on the side too. I farm, and luckily we pretty much got everything done before the rains came. So that's just a little bit more about me. If you guys have any questions at any time before I get started here, please just have Julie interrupt me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at any time. So things I want to talk about today. So what we're going to start off with is actually, a high-level view of Office 365, of PowerShell, and from there, one of the things I want to kind of give you a bit of a heads up. I do apologize. This particular slide deck is built around SharePoint on-prem. I'm building one for SharePoint Online that does basically the same thing, but right now this is actually focused on SharePoint on-prem. But a lot of the concepts and things like that I'm going to talk about today is good for both ends. So I'm going to do a bit of a high-level comparison of scripting versus what you can do with the graphical user interface or the GUI. And then I'm going to kind of show you how to go about building your scripts. If you are already developers, a lot of the concepts I'm going to talk about you're probably familiar with. If you're not, these are just things that make your day-to-day a whole lot easier as you're building your scripts, and as things get more, you do more and more with your PowerShell scripts. And then we're going to finish off with what should you script, and we'll do some examples and some demos. So to start things off, SharePoint's been around for a long time now. It was first released back in 2006. And it was basically brought about to address the shortcomings of Microsoft DOS. It's a verb-noun-based language, so you're basically telling the command shell to get object or set object. So, but it's limited. It's not limited to that format. And what I mean is that not everything is get this or do that. It's a big part of PowerShell. But you can also write all kinds of supporting code in PowerShell in their supporting syntax. We'll get to that in here in just a little bit. It's fully extensible. That's what's really great about PowerShell. You have your base PowerShell, commandlet modules, but then you also have some extendable bases, and you can also build your own extensions as well. You have your main core functionality. You can add custom modules. One of the things you can do for, just to give you a good concept of it, PowerShell, if you just open up PowerShell on your Server 2008 or your, I think Windows 10 and Windows 8 had it as well, if you just open up PowerShell, it has no concept of get SP site. And get SP site is a command that gets a site collection object. So what you do is you can actually add the SharePoint module, and suddenly you have tons of more commands at your fingertips. It's also based on the .NET framework, and you can import these assemblies that go along with that. So if you've done any development in the .NET world, PowerShell, once you actually get into PowerShell, it's going to seem like old hat to you. The thing is, that's great coming out now is there's been a release now of what's called PowerShell Core, and PowerShell Core is actually built on the .NET Core framework. So you're not limited to just regular .NET. They're actually upgrading it as they upgrade the .NET assemblies as well. We're not really going to worry so much about the .NET Core or the PowerShell Core framework. We're just going to focus right now on the .NET side of PowerShell. What you're going to find it's used for it's really based for, it is on manipulating your environments and your OS applications and things like that. And while a strong use of PowerShell is gathering information, you're going to find yourself wanting to make changes to the environment more and more. And because of the modularization of PowerShell, you aren't limited to just operating system manipulations. As I said before, you can add modules, so you can start working with other applications like Exchange and SharePoint, which is what we're going to talk about today. You can also use PowerShell to update data within applications if the modules allow it, and if they don't, sometimes there's ways to get around that. So, like I said, this part here was just a high-level discussion of PowerShell. We could honestly spend a lot more time just talking about what PowerShell is and what you can do with it. But, this is a SharePoint conversation, SharePoint user group. We're going to focus on that. But just one thing I want to let you know, if you want any more information about working with PowerShell, you can go to docs.microsoft.com/en-us/PowerShell. Lots and lots of good information there. Shameless plug, I do a lot of blogging around PowerShell as well, especially around SharePoint and PowerShell. So if you're looking for some information on how to do things, maybe I posted something about it. So before I move on, does anyone have any questions about what PowerShell is and what you can do with it? All right.
All good.
All right, thanks, fantastic. So I want to do a bit of a comparison of SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint online, because there is actually quite a difference in what you can do out of the box with SharePoint online SharePoint on-prem compared to SharePoint online. Unfortunately, there's going to be differences, even differences between SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013, 2016. There's differences as well. But what it's mostly based around is limited on the number of built-in commands, and not so much how PowerShell itself is written. So when you are working with SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint online, you're going to be limited. So SharePoint Online PowerShell is actually much more limited in the base commands that are available to you compared to on-prem. So this here is just a quick little graph of comparison of the built-in commandlets or commands that you have out of the box with PowerShell. So in 2010, you had about 531 commands available to you without having to do any extra work. SharePoint 2013, 2016, you're up to about just short of 1,500. SharePoint Online. Now, SharePoint Online is that little orange dot on the right there. Let's just focus in a little bit on that one. So you have a grand total as of, I think, April. Now, maybe there's a little bit more now, but as of April, you have a grand total of 41 built-in commands for SharePoint Online. That's it. So there is some options. There is the this community here. It's called the Community SharePoint Online module. They kind of focus. They built some extra commandlets around SharePoint lists and libraries, but it's very much just focused on that. And you can access them at this URL here. And last time I checked, they are still updating. I don't know if they're quite too terribly regular, but they do update. But I'm going to talk about something else here in just a minute here that might be more of interest to you. Excuse me. So some things need to know about when you're working with online versus on-prem is that when you're working online, you need to have admin rights to the SharePoint tenant. You don't need global admin rights to the overall tenant. You just need access to the SharePoint tenant in order to do anything. Site collection administrator isn't going to be enough because you actually need to log into the tenant at that to get to that level. Most commonly used commands that you're going to use, like even just getting SP Web, you can't do that in online as you can in on-prem. There's no authentication integration. So if you're working in an on-prem environment, you just need to open up PowerShell and it passes through your credentials. You don't have to do anything. when you're logging into SharePoint Online, you are actually going to be authenticating manually in order to get there. And what you're kind of limited to is mostly areas around SharePoint admin. There are ways to get around this. We're going to get into that a little bit. But one thing I want to call out here is what's called CSOM, or client-side object model. That's where a lot of your development, if you're working with scripts in SharePoint Online, you're going to need to learn that. But there is hope. There's an arrow. Yay, there's an arrow. You know, I've given this presentation I don't know how many times, and every time I keep forgetting to fix this arrow. So here's the hope I was talking about. Patterns and practices, and it's also known as PNP. These are going to be, it's an open source project. It's driven by Microsoft. It's not necessarily just Microsoft. Anyone can actually make updates to it, make changes to it, and polls and things like that. But it's overseen by staff at Microsoft. They update monthly, so there's always huge updates going into PNP, and I think this is a way out of date. They've added a ton of commands for SharePoint Online. What they're doing is they're actually, when I talked about CSOMs, the client-side object model, what they're doing is they're creating a facade around all of that. They're building commands into the PNP modules that, so you need to run the verb noun command, and it's doing all the CSOM for you in the back end, so you don't have to do a lot of the extra work. You can get information. Oops. You can get more information and more details about PNP at this location here at github.com. And all right, someone has a question.
David.
Hi, David. I was just curious if there are any issues around compliance with PNP being open source.
Well, for the most part, I don't believe there is. And the reason I say that is it's still run by, still monitored by Microsoft employees, so they have their roadmaps, things they want to focus on, and I do believe they do code reviews before, because it's still, you still have to have your pushes and your pulls approved. As far as compliance, you got to remember it's open source, so you get the code, so you can pull it down yourself and you can make whatever changes you want to your own environment when you're accessing it. But because it's open source, you're right, there is that consideration, but it is closely monitored by Microsoft. Does that help you or answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just mostly concerned about assuaging clients' concerns.
Well, yeah, and I do get that, and the biggest thing that once you basically tell them that Microsoft is while it is open source, Microsoft is effectively the owner in the sense that they are monitoring it, and it is supported by Microsoft development teams. You are going to have the same kind of controls and testing and compliance you're going to have with other Microsoft tools. It's just not going through a Microsoft build process. Internally, that is.
Thanks.
All right, so next thing we're going to talk a little bit more here is, let's do a bit of a comparison of clicking, versus the actual scripting that you can write. Excuse me. So SharePoint allows you to do a lot with the GUI. There's really not much you can't do. So why would you actually want to write a PowerShell script? Especially when SharePoint Online, where the basic commandlets aren't available to you. This is what we're going to talk about here. So what I did when I was preparing this presentation is I want, you take it for granted how many times you click and things like that. So I sat down and I wanted to see how many times for basic day-to-day things do I click in a SharePoint GUI. So the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to create just a single site column, just a basic site column. And so what I found was, you're averaging between 6 to 12 clicks depending on all the options you need. And if you're building a lookup list, well, that's building the list to go towards that column is part of the process as well. So you're going to have a ton more clicks if you're building a list to go along with your lookup. Creating a single content type, you're looking at about 6 to 8 to create it. And then depending on how many columns you need to add or remove and other settings, you could be having a whole lot more. Creating that list, so at least 6 clicks. From start to finish, you're clicking at least 6 different times, going through different screens. Again, as soon as you want to start adding in custom content types or adding site columns or different columns, your clicks increase. So, you think about this, and in a solution, you could be creating multiple site columns, you're creating multiple even content types or lists. It gets more and more, it builds up. So let's think about it here with PowerShell. In PowerShell, I'm going to assume I've already built a script for it. So I'm going to create, I want to say, a single site column with PowerShell. So I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but when I want to create a site column, I just modify my config file, and then with a single line of execution, I've run my script, my single site column is created for me. What about a content type? Same thing, modify a config file, single line to execute my script, my content types are there with the site columns I want within it. What about creating a list? Same thing, I think you're seeing a pattern here. You modify a config file, you single line of execution, and you run your script, and your list is created, and any settings you want are added to it as well. Now, one thing I want you to know, I'm not trying to make you go from this to this. Hopefully that worked on your end. You can see Jim Carrey going absolutely crazy on a keyboard. This isn't what we're trying to do here. However, I want to talk about when you do and you don't want to. When you do and you don't want to script, we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to talk more about, as we're kind of on this topic, how you design and you build your scripts. So a bit of a disclaimer here, I do this every time. People build things differently. It's just the nature, things make sense to us. That's why SharePoint has like a million ways to do the same thing. People think differently, so they want, the way I'm describing the way to do things here is kind of how I found it, and my team found the best way to build things out. If it doesn't work for you, maybe you can modify what I'm telling you today to make it work for your environment. So first concept are helper files. So a helper file, the idea behind it is you don't want to place everything in one big giant script. The reason being, if you have a problem, you got to find it, you got to deal with it. Making a change could affect different things. You want to actually separate and modularize that out. Apparently English is hard today. Sorry, guys. Break things off into common modules. And what I mean is, don't just, have one main file and one helper file. What I actually like to do is anything that's specific to a particular area. So if I'm dealing with lists, I have a list helper file. If I'm dealing with workflows, I actually have a workflow helper file. If I'm building queries for gathering data, I actually have a helper file just for that. So everything's separated, and I only need to use what I need for that particular job. So what you're doing now is you're loading what you need. Not everything that you could maybe use is going to be there. Granted, we're not in the days of, you had to minimize the amount of code because you had such incremental amounts of memory or CPU usage, but, it's just good practice. Just load what you need. So what does a helper or a common module look like? So in this example here, I'm actually not even doing a SharePoint related helper file. This is actually a logging file. And all I'm doing here is I'm taking in some dynamic variables and I'm building out a log file at a certain path, and I'm pending a message just saying I'm starting the process. This is where the log file is going to be that piece, and returning actually the log file path to the calling function, because I'm going to be using that everywhere anytime I want to log something that happened within my script. We'll take a closer look at it here. You can see here I'm just dealing with the path and the log file name and then the process description, and that builds it out. Now, because this is actually so dynamic, I don't need to change it every single time I do a new script. It's already there. I just change the values I pass into it. So essentially what I'm asking you to do here is building out a PowerShell framework. Things that you can reuse over and over again without having to make changes every time you do something new. This one here, same idea. I'm actually appending to the log now. They've got the log already. There's that. I've got the log file path. That's that value I sent back in the previous function. And this time, I'm just logging a message. I build the message, I add it to my log file, and I'm done. Again, this is something I don't need to change every time I'm doing a new process within PowerShell. So the other thing, like I talked about, you want to separate out your processes, your list accesses, your query builders, that sort of thing. So in this one here, it's very generic. I'm just updating a single value in an item. I'm not updating, it doesn't matter what the name of that item is, I'm passing that in because I want this to be dynamic, I want it to be reusable. So I'm passing in the, the list items, the item I actually want to update, the field I want to update, and the value I want to change it to. And then, good practices, you always put inside of a try catch, because if you accidentally send a value to a field that's not compatible or whatever else happens, maybe the object isn't actually there, you want to error report on that so you know exactly what you're doing and where your errors happened. So here's another one. This is where I'm actually building a query. So this is very basic. It's again, it's a completely different module, and I just want to get all the items. And I'm adding a row limit and things like that. That's just best practice when you're gathering information. But that's all this is I'm just building it again because I loaded it into a separate module. If I don't need it, I don't need to load it. But on top of that, again, I'm not having to rewrite or reinvent the wheel every time I do this. I'm just taking code I've already written, completely dynamic, and I don't need to change anything. So any questions about any of those examples I gave you? Okay. Fantastic. So I've talked about this a couple times, the config file. So what is the config file? In general, the config file simply allows for modifications, of your environment for different requirements. So if, say for instance, I wrote a script that created a site column on a list, site column in a site, then, instead of having to go and rewrite that code, I just take the code and I take the information that I need into the config file, modify that, rewrite the code. What this does now is I'm changing it in one place, I'm not changing it in multiple places, and also because I'm not changing the code, the risk of having a bad execution is very low because you haven't touched that. All you've changed is the configuration component. So because of that, reuse of your code is very, very easy. And I talked about here, you can use it to make changes to your script without actually modifying the script, because what you're changing now is the values that you are going to be implementing. You're not changing the script itself, you're changing the values that you want the script to execute. You can use any type of file. You can import a text file or anything like that. I recommend XML. The reason being is XML, PowerShell has a fantastic XML parser. It's really, really good. And it's built in. You don't have to write in anything extra, and it's really easy to use. So I'm going to show you here real quick, an example of a config file. So what this was for was a process I built where, so those of you who are still in on-prem, you know that there's that issue when you're building a workflow that if you want the workflow to email a distribution list or people outside of the site collection or even outside the environment, it can't do that because it only is able to email people who are authenticated inside the site collection. So what I did was I built a workflow actually that updated another list that allowed me then to use PowerShell to send out the emails. So what this config file does is the first part here is I've got my helper module, so I'm defining what I'm going to be using in my PowerShell script. So I'm going to be accessing a list, so I wanted the list helper. I'm going to be building a query, so I wanted the query functions helper, and then I wanted to do some logging, so I loaded those three modules, the script logging module being the last one. And then inside here is all the different components that I'm going to be using within my my application, my PowerShell script. So accessing the config is actually really, really straightforward. You start off with, you can default to just you can provide a default of where you think your script is. This is only going to be accessed if you don't define it when you execute the PowerShell script. And the next thing you should do when you're doing anything PowerShell is make sure that your SharePoint PowerShell module is loaded. If it isn't, it'll load it for you. If it is already loaded, it's just going to keep on going. Next thing you're going to do is make sure that your config file that you provided is there. So the test path is that test-path. All it does is test to make sure that the path I gave it exists. If it doesn't, I'm going to throw out an error and I'm going to exit. Now you notice here I'm writing to the host, and the reason I'm doing that and not writing to my log is if the config file path is gone, it won't be able to write to the log file, so I have to actually write to the screen. Now here's where the magic happens. Right now I'm actually passing the entire config file as an XML object into a variable called send email config. And then from there, I can make use of all that information that is in my config file. So looking back at my config file now, the information I want is in that email list. So if you take a look here, in my code, I'm actually looping through every item within the send email config helper modules.module. So let's go back to the config here. If you take a look, I have elements and I have parents and children. So if you take a look at flip back and forth on you here, but I'm looking at .config.helper modules.module. So if you take a look here, at the top level, I have a config. Underneath the config, I have a helper modules, and then inside of that, I have a module line. And so what's happening here is I'm going through each one of those, and I'm loading them into my script command, my command shell. So I don't actually have to write all of this code into one line. I'm loading it separately. Any questions? Does that make sense to everybody? Perfect. All right. So now we've got those values. What are we going to do with them? So let's take a look here. So again, I've got that email config here, and I'm going to be accessing the email list component. So remember, in my config file, that's this here. So inside my email lists, I have an email list, and that's what this is allowing me to do is that if I have multiple solutions I need to do this with, I have multiple lists in different locations, I can add a different one so that the script will actually look in each one of those SharePoint lists to find data. It won't have to I won't have to make multiple copies of the script. The config file will now allow me to move to look in different places. So back on my script here, I'm looking at the email list.parent site name and email list.list name. So remember, in my for each, I'm passing that particular section of the variable into an email list variable, and so email list.parent site name. So if we take a look again at the config, Oh, sorry, I missed one. If we look back at the config, I have the list name and I have the last name, or the names are all in there. So that's how you actually are able to gather, just like an object model programming. You can actually, it's actually an object property of the value. And here I'm actually building out the message itself, and all I'm doing is I'm saying that I get the value from the list in the so again, sorry, let me back up here. I'd be pointing at my screen right now, which makes a whole lot more sense to you guys. I do apologize. In my config file, I'm actually defining what the column name is, because in my solution, when I actually added the entry for the email into the list, I'm actually adding who the email is supposed to go to, who it's from, what the subject is, and what the body is. So what that means, though, is that I need to make sure that my script knows where to get that information, because it could be dynamic. It can't be the same for everything, so it could be different. So I want to tell it that the email sender field is called email sender, or that the email body field is called email body. So that's what I'm doing here, is I've got my actual list item, so the email item, and I'm just passing in the name of the column to get the value to pass to my subject. And then once that's all done, I just do a send message to, and then send mail message, sorry, is just a standard PowerShell commandlet. I pass in the values that I've built, and it sends out the message for me. It would be great if we could do this from a 2013 or a 2013 workflow, but unfortunately you can't. And that's basically all you need to do when you're actually using your config file, is you are just building it out, passing it into an object, and accessing the values within that object. Any questions about that process at all? Okay, you guys are easy. All right, building the script. So the idea behind this here is, when do you want to build and how do you want to build it? So any significant script that you want to write, it should have three components. Obviously, you're going to have your main script, you're going to have your config file, and you're going to have any helper files. That's really all you need to worry about when you're building a script. Do you have to have a helper file? Of course not. I just strongly advise it, because like I said before, it's what allows you to do your code reuse. The config file, same thing. The idea behind all of this is not to rewrite things over and over again. If at the most, what you want to do is want to build on what you've got already. So when do you want to write, when do you not want to write a script? When must you use PowerShell scripts? When there's something you can't be done with a GUI. There are certain things, for instance, one of the things as a admin you're going to want to use a lot is merging your log file is really easy. So you're going to want to write a script for that. Again, that's just a single line. But what if I want to actually build something a little bit more? When you're actually building out site collections, if you build a site collection from a GUI and you want to create a new content database with that, in the back end, in your database itself, you're going to get your database name, but then it appends a GUID to it, and they're just ugly. It's just hard to work with. If you're doing some back end development, you have to remember what the GUIDs are all the time. So if you're doing it with PowerShell, you can say, I want my database name to be this exactly. Don't change it, and that's what's going to happen. Up until recently, you couldn't restore any deleted site collections without PowerShell. A PowerShell script was required to do that. So these are the kind of things that you need to do PowerShell scripts for. Is basically boils down to is if you're doing things, and it's usually configuration things that you can't do with the GUI. Now, it stands to reason if you want to do certain reporting and things like that, if you don't want to use the reporting web parts and SQL Server integration, then you might want to write your reports with PowerShell as opposed to maybe a .NET app, because PowerShell, you don't have to worry about all the extra compiling and overhead. You just write the script, you get the data, and away you go. When should you write PowerShell scripts? For repeatable processes, things that you're going to be doing often, creating site columns, building lists, building solutions. Something I use all the time is, like one of the examples here is actually creating a list with a number of site columns. I've got a script that I built years ago that I did that. I had a friend one day tweet, he was building out a really large solution. He was complaining on Twitter about how long it took, and I said, hey, I got this. Does it help you out? And what turned into 2 hours of work for him went a whole lot quicker. So anything that you're going to be doing over and over again, that's going to take a lot of clicking. Remember, we talked at the beginning about how many clicks it takes to do a site column and a content type in the list. Anything like that, you want to repeat it over and over again. You want to write it as a site call, or sorry, as a PowerShell script. When you need stronger control of the outcome, so names, orders of how things are supposed to look, that sort of thing, that's when you want to write a PowerShell script. And when it's going to take more time to click through all the steps. Lots of times, unless you are a absolute PowerShell guru, which I will never admit to being, sometimes you just, the PowerShell script just seems like it's going to take longer. It's the reuse component, the part that you get to do over and over and over again, that makes it all worthwhile. When should you not use a PowerShell script? When it takes longer to actually update the config file and to click through the process. So if you've got a really long config file and different settings and things like that, it's probably not worth it if you're just creating something simple. But if it's not the case, or again, you're going to be reusing something, you want to reuse a PowerShell script. But there are times when, if I'm just going to go and create a list column as opposed to a site column or something like that, maybe I'll just go and do it in the GUI real quick, especially now that Microsoft's made it so much easier by just clicking on the list column itself. But in the end, it's entirely a judgment call on your part. It doesn't, if you are more comfortable with the GUI and you're getting things done, great. But if you're getting sick and tired of clicking and waiting for the page to refresh and all that kind of stuff, maybe you want to write the PowerShell script. So I'm going to do a quick demo here, but I wanted to find out if anybody had any questions about any of the concepts when you should and shouldn't create a PowerShell script. Does everything else make pretty much good sense? All right. So we're going to try something here. I hope this works for you guys. I've actually got a video. I want to do a comparison of creating a solution through the GUI to doing it with PowerShell. So what my example here is an example. Somebody wanted a time off request, built it into a SharePoint list. They could do all that just so they could build into list, track it, everything was done there. So I did it, site columns and look up lists and things like that. And I just wanted to see how long it took and compare it to actually executing a script. So I'm going to run this here. Let me know if it doesn't run on your end, and we'll have to get around that. So what's happening now is I'm actually going through. I'm going to build my site columns, and so here's an example now. I'm building a site column. I'm doing all the clicking. Good, great to hear. So I want to create, into a new group, putting in the information for the site column. Now, through the power of pre-recorded demos, I am speeding things up for you, and we're going to put some more information here. I'm going to build all of my columns. Hey, look at me go. So one of the things I like talking about, I'm sure everyone is aware of this, but when you're building out an environment, building your site columns and things like that, do yourself a favor. It's an extra step, but don't put spaces in your columns because it gets really ugly in the back end. So what I'm doing now, one of those extra steps you got to do. I'm building a lookup list. So now I'm building I'm building a lookup list and putting in putting in the content into it, fixing it up. So here I am going back in. I'm fixing my columns, adding my data. Look at me go. I wish I could type like this in real life, because man, I get stuff done. All right, keep on going. How are we doing here? All right, so we're about halfway down the video, so just bear with me here. So I'm going to speed things up again. Now, one of the things here that you're not seeing here, I think, is I'm adding all the choice columns and stuff like that. So, again, just looking at the video, you can see I'm going back and forth. I'm building out my information. Now I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to be putting in all the spaces. I'm going to clean things up so that it looks better on the actual solution, determine if it needs to be required, that kind of thing. And we're going to fly through it. I think we're just about done. So what I've done here is I've created a solution. It's got one content type, and it has about a dozen different site columns within it. So now I'm building the parent list, and I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to add the content type I just built. I'm going to put it in there, and I'm done. So this took about 3 minutes to show you, 2.5, 3 minutes to show you while I was talking through it. In actuality, this took about, and granted, this was with me having a piece of paper, so I knew exactly what I was looking for. It took me 22 minutes to build all that out, or 18 minutes what it took to build it all out. So I'm going to show you now what it's like when you script it. So now here's what we're going to see here is I need to bring up my VMs, and hopefully I don't lose you. All right.
David, you there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, got quiet.
Okay. Hold on, guys. I'm in my office, and they just turned the lights off on me. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. All right, so I still got you?
Yes. Yes.
All right, but you guys don't see my screen anymore, right?
We actually see the video.
Okay, let's just see. I'm going to try and do this again. So what you should see now is a SharePoint site that says New Hampshire SPUG. Do you guys see that yet?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So this is the site. I've got the script already written, and just to give you an example of what my script looks like. Or the config file. Oops. You know what? Let's do this differently.
Did we lose you?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Okay, we got you. You're not presenting, though.
At the location, but I think what might be happening is that my system, I actually run, when I run an on-prem environment, I actually run, okay. I'm going to see if I can do something here quick, just bear with me. Can you guys still hear me? Okay.
Yep.
All right, so let's try this one more time. You can send it off to everybody. I do apologize.
No worries. Don't kill yourself over it.
Send the email to Julie when I've got it up there so you guys can take a look. But in a nutshell, that 20 minutes that it took me to do the all right. What was the last thing you guys heard me say?
You said in a nutshell it took 20 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So in a nutshell, when I did it with the GUI, it took about 20 minutes roughly. Running the script that I built, it took all of about 35 seconds to build up the environment. So that's where the power of the scripting comes in. Because the thing is that a solution like that, you know, I built it specifically for HR. Well, you know, yes, I could have built it as an add-in with code and stuff like that, and then just deployed it in different places. But this is kind of a nice other solution for those of you who aren't developers and are more on the admin side. That's kind of where this comes in handy. So I will share. I think I'm just about done. All right, you should see my slide deck again. Just a second here. All right. Okay, fantastic. Let's see, loading. All right. So, does anyone have any questions about that whole process? I wish I could have shown you kind of like what the key things were about that script that I wrote, but I will put the script up on my website so you guys can take a look at it for yourself. The config file, to write it initially, it took time. I won't lie. It probably took me probably a good day to write out the script and the config file and stuff like that. But to actually modify the config file, it's just copy and pasting. To reuse it, to reuse the script, you're probably looking at a couple of minutes just to go and modify the fields. And again, if you're doing something brand spanking new, it's a lot of it's just copy and paste, because you're just defining the fields. So you copy and paste the fields, you change the name, and away you go. Exactly, 20 minutes versus, so 20 minutes to do it on the GUI. And remember too, when you do it in the GUI, you always run the risk of typing something wrong or clicking a wrong button. With this script, you can check your work before you execute it, and you're done in 5 minutes. All right, so I think you guys have listened to me enough. Any questions at all? Okay, so if you go to prairiedeveloper.com, I will put that up before I leave the office tonight. So the website's on the screen right now, prairiedeveloper.com. My deck will be there. The other thing too is I'll try and get those scripts done here maybe over the weekend. Well, you know what? It's Thanksgiving up in here in Canada. It's Thanksgiving, so I probably won't get the scripts done this weekend. But I'll try and get it done for you guys for next week.